By the summer of 1942, the skies over Europe had become a killing ground. The Luftwaffe still reigned supreme, its pilots seasoned from years of victory. From the steppes of Russia to the cliffs of France, German aircraft patrolled the clouds with ruthless efficiency. But none struck more fear into Allied hearts than the Focke-Wulf 190, the sleek, predatory fighter they called the Butcher Bird. It was the pride of the Reich's engineering genius, fast, agile, and lethal. The FW-190 could dive faster than any Allied aircraft, roll tighter, and outclimb almost anything that dared challenge it. Its twin 20 cannons could shred a bomber in seconds, and its radial engine could take punishment that would cripple a Spitfire. When it appeared in the skies over the English Channel in 1941, it caught the Royal Air Force off guard. Spitfires that had once ruled the air now found themselves outmatched. British pilots who survived those encounters described it with awe and dread, a machine that seemed alive, as if it were hunting. The FW-190's success wasn't just mechanical, it was psychological. For the first time since the Battle of Britain, the Luftwaffe had regained the edge. RAF squadrons scrambled to adapt, upgrading their aircraft and changing tactics, but the mystery of the Butcher Bird's design remained. What made it so deadly? What secrets of engineering had the Germans unlocked? The Allies needed answers, but the aircraft was an enigma cloaked in smoke and distance, untouchable, always returning across the channel before it could be caught. In occupied France, Luftwaffe pilots reveled in their dominance. Among them was Oberleutnant Armin Faber, a decorated pilot from Jagdschwader II Richthofen, one of Germany's elite fighter wings. He was young, confident, and precise, the model of the Luftwaffe officer corps. His record was exemplary, his flying immaculate. To his peers, Faber was both talented and disciplined, the kind of man the Reich trusted to test its most advanced machines. But beneath that polished exterior was a simmering exhaustion familiar to every airman of the war. Endless sorties, constant loss, the creeping fatigue of combat. Even the most skilled could falter, and on a clear June day in 1942, the skies over Britain would bear witness to a mistake so improbable that it would change the course of the air war itself. June 23rd began like any other mission. Faber's flight of FW-190s had engaged RAF Spitfires over the Bristol Channel. It was one of countless dogfights in that furious summer, brief, brutal encounters where death came in seconds. The battle unfolded in violent spirals, engines screaming, guns blazing, contrails carving white scars across the sky. In the chaos, Faber became separated from his squadron. He was an ace and he didn't panic. He banked sharply north, scanning for landmarks. But the sky over Wales looked deceptively similar to that over northern France. The same coastlines, the same fields, the slightest navigational error, a few degrees off, could make friend indistinguishable from foe. As he descended, convinced he was crossing into German-occupied territory, he radioed his base for bearings. Static. The radio sputtered uselessly. Below him, the green hills of Wales shimmered in the sunlight, familiar, he thought, friendly. Faber turned toward what he believed was his home airfield. At RAF Pembrey in South Wales, the ground crew had just finished refueling Spitfires. The war felt distant for a brief moment, until a silhouette appeared out of the western sky. At first, they assumed it was a returning British fighter. Then came the sound, a low, throaty roar that no one on the ground recognized. One mechanic, an experienced crewman, dropped his wrench. "That's not one of ours," he murmured. The aircraft banked smoothly, its wings flashing the black cross of the Luftwaffe. Panic rippled across the airfield. Soldiers scrambled for rifles, mechanics dove for cover, and the control tower erupted in disbelief. The Focke-Wulf circled once, slowly, confidently, and then began its landing approach. The men on the ground could hardly believe what they were seeing. The Butcher Bird was coming in to land. Faber, still unaware of his mistake, guided his aircraft down with the calm precision of routine. The runway stretched before him, and he eased the throttle, flaps down, wheels extended. The FW-190's tires kissed the tarmac with a hiss. The moment it rolled to a stop, British personnel surrounded it in stunned silence. One RAF sergeant later described it as watching a tiger walk into a cage and shut the door behind itself. Inside the cockpit, Faber finally noticed the difference. The men outside wore khaki, not gray. The trucks bore roundels, not crosses, and the rifles aimed directly at him were unmistakably British. He froze, realization dawning too late. When the ground crew ordered him out at gunpoint, he raised his hands and climbed down, bewildered. "Where am I?" he asked in English, his voice unsteady. The sergeant replied, "You're in Wales, mate. Welcome to the RAF. Word of the event spread like wildfire through British command. The impossible had happened. The Allies now possessed an intact Focke-Wulf 190. It wasn't shot down, scavenged, or broken. It had landed itself into their hands. Intelligence officers descended on RAF Pembrey within hours. The aircraft was quickly secured under armed guard and Faber taken into custody. In London, Air Chief Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory reportedly smiled when he received the telegram. "Gentlemen," he said to his staff, "we've just won the engineering lottery." For British intelligence, the FW-190 was a gift beyond measure. Until that day, every analysis of the German fighter had been based on wreckage, shattered pieces of metal, charred engines, and fragments that told only part of the story. Now, for the first time, they could examine it whole, its wings, its cockpit, its guns, its instruments, a complete masterpiece of German aviation. Faber's landing, a mere navigational error, had achieved what months of espionage and combat had failed to do. It was the kind of twist that seemed almost divine or absurd. In war, genius often failed where luck triumphed. That night, as British engineers carefully examined the plane under floodlights, they marveled at its craftsmanship. One officer ran his hand along the smooth aluminum skin and whispered, "Now we'll know what makes you tick." Somewhere in the same compound, Faber sat under guard, trying to comprehend his fate. He had given his enemy the crown jewel of the Luftwaffe, and he would spend the rest of the war a prisoner of that same enemy. But the machine he had flown, the one he trusted, would now become a weapon against his own side. The butcher bird had crossed the channel one final time, not as a predator, but as a teacher. And in the days to come, what the Allies learned from its steel wings would change the balance of power in the skis forever. The Focke-Wulf 190 sat in the hangar at RAF Farnborough like a sleeping predator, its dark green paint dulled under British floodlights. Every rivet, every curve, every cable of its body radiated menace. To the men surrounding it, engineers, pilots, and intelligence officers, it was as if an alien creature had fallen to Earth. The most feared weapon in the Luftwaffe's arsenal was now theirs to touch, study, and dismantle. It was July 1942, and the air war over Europe hung in fragile balance. British Spitfires were still outclassed by the mysterious new German fighter that had terrorized them for months. Now, for the first time, they could see it up close. The excitement inside the hangar was electric. Some men took careful notes, others simply stood in silence, staring. The machine was both beautiful and brutal, a perfect fusion of engineering and instinct. Engineers from the Royal Aircraft Establishment began their work like archaeologists unearthing a relic. They stripped the fuselage, examined the cowling, and catalogued every bolt and plate. The first surprise came quickly: the engine. It wasn't an inline like the Spitfire's Merlin. It was a BMW 801 radial, a powerhouse of 14 cylinders that produced over 1,700 horsepower. It gave the Focke-Wulf its distinctive roar, its ability to dive without choking from negative G-forces. Where Allied aircraft coughed and sputtered in sudden drops, the German engine thrived. Then came the wings. The RAF engineers marveled at their strength. The FW-190's wide, elliptical structure gave it a roll rate unmatched by any Allied plane. It could snap through turns and recover instantly, a dance of steel and air. The Spitfire pilots who had faced it were right. It could twist around them faster than they could think. But the real revelation came in the cockpit. British test pilot Captain Eric Winkle Brown, one of the few men brave enough to fly captured enemy planes, climbed into the seat. He was struck by how simple and clean the design was. German ergonomics were years ahead of anyone else. Every dial and switch lay exactly where it should. A pilot's aircraft, Brown would later call it, built by men who understood the pilot's mind. For days, the engineers ran tests. They weighed the aircraft, measured its wingspan, analyzed its center of gravity. They discovered its weaknesses as well: the heavy controls at high speeds, the tendency to lose agility at altitude, and the narrow landing gear that made it unstable on rough fields. But even its flaws were lessons. Every note, every calculation would be fed back into British and American design rooms. On July 29th, Captain Brown took the FW-190 into the air for the first official Allied test flight. As he taxied down the runway, the aircraft's growl filled the airfield, a deep, resonant sound that turned heads across Farnborough. When the wheels lifted, the butcher bird came alive again. Brown later wrote that flying it was like shaking hands with the enemy and finding his grip stronger than yours. He looped, rolled, and dived the aircraft, testing every maneuver. The controls responded instantly, alive with precision. "It was like flying a piece of engineering perfection," he said afterward, breathless. But the flight also revealed the key to victory. Above 25,000 feet, the FW-190 struggled. Its engine lost power, its movements grew sluggish. There in the thin air where Spitfires and Thunderbolts thrived, the advantage shifted. When the test reports reached fighter command, strategies began to change overnight. British pilots were briefed on the FW-190's strengths and its fatal flaw. It was unbeatable at low altitude but vulnerable above the clouds. Squadrons trained accordingly. Dogfights that had once ended in disaster began turning in the Allies' favor. In a matter of weeks, the knowledge from that single captured aircraft reshaped Allied air tactics. American designers studying the data adjusted their own aircraft designs, particularly the P-47 Thunderbolt and later the P-51 Mustang, focusing on high-altitude performance, engine cooling, and roll stability. What had begun as one man's navigational mistake was now rippling across continents and factories. While the Allies dissected the butcher bird, its former pilot sat thousands of miles away in captivity. Armin Faber had been interrogated by RAF intelligence before being shipped to a POW camp in Canada. He was treated humanely, but word of his blunder followed him. Other prisoners called him the man who delivered the Luftwaffe's secret. It was a bitter joke, but he accepted it silently. The mistake had been his alone, a moment's misjudgment born of exhaustion and overconfidence. Back in Europe, the Luftwaffe scrambled to understand how the Allies were adapting so quickly. German pilots noticed that their once feared FW-190s were being met with new tactics, Spitfires that climbed higher, attacked from above, and refused to fight on German terms. Rumors spread of a captured aircraft, but few believed them. The idea that one of their own had simply landed in enemy hands seemed too absurd to be true. In the quiet halls of British intelligence, however, no one laughed. They knew exactly what had been gained. The FW-190 was more than a machine. It was insight into how the enemy thought, how German engineers balanced speed, firepower, and survival. Every screw and rivet spoke of a design philosophy now laid bare to Allied minds. As 1942 turned to 1943, new Spitfire variants took to the air, lighter, faster, and tailored to exploit the weaknesses discovered in the captured Focke-Wulf. Pilots who once feared the butcher bird now sought it out. "Keep high," their briefings read. "Hit fast, make him climb, and he's yours." At Farnborough, the FW-190 remained under constant study. Engineers stripped it, rebuilt it, flew it again. Its image appeared in training manuals, its blueprints replicated and shared. The Allies had turned the enemy's pride into a teacher, and from its wings came the seeds of victory. For Armin Faber, the war was over long before it ended. In his Canadian camp, he grew quiet, introspective. He read books, wrote letters, and kept to himself. He never tried to justify his mistake. Perhaps he understood that in the grand scale of war, even error had its purpose. His single misjudgment had cost the Reich one of its greatest secrets, and in doing so had saved countless lives. The Allies didn't boast of the capture. It remained a quiet triumph, buried beneath larger victories and bloodier headlines. Yet among pilots and engineers, the story passed like legend. The day a German ace flew his fighter straight into an RAF base and handed them the key to the skis. The butcher bird had been tamed. And as its engine cooled in that British hangar, a new phase of the air war began, one where intelligence, not just courage, would decide who ruled the clouds. By 1943, the balance of air power over Europe had begun to shift. The Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces were no longer chasing shadows. They knew their enemy, its engines, its limits, its weaknesses. The secrets drawn from Armin Faber's captured Focke-Wulf 190 had become part of every Allied briefing, every training manual, every new aircraft blueprint. The transformation began quietly. Pilots who had once cursed the butcher bird now studied its anatomy like scholars. Diagrams of the FW-190's silhouette were pinned to briefing room walls, annotated with red ink. Avoid low-level turning fights, attack from altitude, force climb. Training films dissected its combat behavior frame by frame. Even its cockpit layout, photographed from every angle, taught Allied engineers how German design philosophy worked. The ergonomics, the instinctive placement of controls, the prioritization of stability over comfort. At first, the results were subtle. Dogfights that had once ended with burning Spitfires began to end with FW-190's trailing smoke. Squadrons adapted quickly, climbing higher before engagement, diving from the sun, forcing German pilots into the thin air their engines hated. Each encounter became a lesson, each victory a confirmation that intelligence could outfly fear. In early 1943, the upgraded Spitfire Mk-IX entered service, its Rolls-Royce Merlin 61 engine delivering power even above 25,000 feet, the very ceiling where the Focke-Wulf began to choke. Allied pilots spoke of it with reverence. It was the first machine since the Butcher Bird's debut that made them feel equal again. "Now we can look them in the eye," one pilot said after his first sortie. The Americans were learning, too. Their P-47 Thunderbolt, once criticized for its weight, suddenly found its purpose. Armed with knowledge of German tactics, it exploited its own strengths: dive speed, firepower, and durability. At high altitude, it was invincible. Below, where the FW-190 ruled, pilots simply refused to follow. "Let the Hun come up for his supper," an American squadron commander quipped. But behind these tactical shifts lay something deeper, a philosophical change in how the Allies fought. For the first time, intelligence was treated as a weapon equal to aircraft and guns. Engineers, scientists, and analysts became as crucial to victory as aces and bombers. The captured Focke-Wulf was the perfect symbol of that new warfare, knowledge born from error. In late 1943, at Farnborough, test pilots continued to push the captured plane to its limits. Every vibration, every roll rate, every temperature fluctuation was recorded and studied. They simulated combat scenarios, flying Spitfires against it to practice countermaneuvers. Out of these experiments came new tactics that would define Allied air strategy for the rest of the war: energy fighting, boom and zoom attacks, altitude advantage doctrines. From those hangars, the lessons spread to the front lines. In the skies above France and the Low Countries, Allied formations moved with new confidence. Radio chatter, once filled with warnings, now carried steady, methodical commands. "Climb, roll, dive. He can't follow you up." Meanwhile, in occupied Europe, German pilots began to sense the change. The FW-190 was still formidable, but its edge dulled. The enemy now knew its rhythm. What had been an ambush had become a contest. Luftwaffe reports from late 1943 tell of frustration. "The Tommies are learning. They fight differently. They stay above. We can no longer surprise them." Armin Faber, far from the front, heard none of this directly. In his Canadian camp, letters arrived from home only rarely, and the news of the war came filtered through rumor. Still, he must have wondered. He would later admit, years after the war, that he dreamed often of that day, the moment he mistook the Welsh coast for France, the realization as he stepped from his aircraft and saw British rifles aimed at him. "I thought it was the end of me," he said in an interview decades later. "I did not know it was the end of something much larger." By the end of 1943, the Allies had turned information into dominance. RAF squadrons that had once fought to survive were now leading offensives. Over the Atlantic, Allied air cover began closing the deadly gap where U-boats once prowled unchallenged. The P-47 and new P-51 Mustangs escorted bombers deep into Germany, and the Luftwaffe found itself stretched thin. The irony was impossible to ignore. The very aircraft that had symbolized German supremacy now served as a blueprint for its undoing. Allied engineers borrowed ideas shamelessly, streamlined cowling designs, cockpit arrangement, cooling systems, and then improved them. It was not imitation, but evolution born from understanding. At Farnborough, the once feared FW-190 was now a training tool. Young pilots learned to recognize its shape, its sound, its climb profile. Some even flew it under supervision, feeling for themselves what their enemies felt in combat. The Butcher Bird had become a teacher, its lessons extracted from every piston and propeller blade. The skies over Europe told the story in smoke and contrails. In the spring of 1944, as preparations for the Normandy invasion gathered pace, Allied air superiority was nearly complete. German fighters that rose to meet the bombers did so against overwhelming numbers and better-informed opponents. The captured Focke-Wulf, once a symbol of fear, now sat quietly in a hangar, its usefulness fulfilled. Yet the war's cruelty remained. Intelligence could turn the tide, but men still died by the hundreds each day in those same skis. Pilots who benefited from Faber's mistake rarely knew his name. They only knew that their chances had improved, that they could climb higher, live longer, and perhaps see another sunrise. In this way, the story of the captured Focke-Wulf was less about machines and more about the fragile line between mastery and misjudgment. A single pilot, lost in his bearings, had reshaped the logic of the air war. Every mission flown thereafter carried a trace of that era, transformed into knowledge and survival. By 1944, the British classified report on the FW-190 had reached American and Soviet allies alike. The insights rippled through Allied research labs, influencing everything from engine design to pilot training. Even after the war, those documents would guide engineers into the jet age. And all of it began with one landing, an accident of navigation, a trick of light over the Welsh coast. As the sun set on 1943, the Allies finally looked skyward with confidence. The days of running from the butcher bird were over. They had learned its secrets, adapted its lessons, and in doing so discovered a truth older than war itself. The mightiest weapon is not the machine in the sky, but the mind that learns how to defeat it. When the war finally ended in 1945, the world exhaled. Cities smoldered, nations mourned, and skis once alive with the thunder of engines fell silent. Yet somewhere in that quiet, the story of one strange landing, one act of human error, remained alive among pilots, engineers, and strategists. The capture of the Focke-Wulf 190 had long since become legend inside the Royal Air Force, a story retold in classrooms and hangars as proof that even in a war of machines, the smallest human mistake could move history. At Farnborough, the butcher bird was still there. It had been repainted in RAF colors, its black crosses replaced with roundels. The aircraft looked almost British now, but it retained a kind of defiant dignity, as if aware that its existence had betrayed the nation that built it. Engineers used it for demonstrations, flight tests, and eventually for training pilots of new jet aircraft. For them, it was a monument to curiosity, the physical embodiment of a lesson that intelligence could conquer fear. As the Allies transitioned from propellers to jets, the lessons of the FW-190 didn't vanish. They evolved. British engineers studying its control systems realized how the Germans had achieved such stability at high roll rates. That research directly influenced early jet fighters like the Gloucester Meteor and later the Hawker Hunter. Across the Atlantic, American designers examined reports from Farnborough and applied the same insights to post-war aircraft, such as the F-86 Sabre. The butcher bird's legacy was etched into the DNA of future air combat. The intelligence community, too, absorbed its lesson. The FW-190's capture became a case study in what they called serendipitous intelligence, the idea that victory sometimes depends not only on strategy or technology, but on chance and on the readiness to exploit it. British and American officers later admitted that had the aircraft been destroyed or ignored as a curiosity, months, perhaps years, of progress might have been lost. But for Armin Faber, the man at the center of it all, there was no celebration, only reflection. He spent the rest of the war in a Canadian prisoner-of-war camp, surrounded by the same monotony that numbed thousands of captured soldiers. He was treated with the fairness the Geneva Convention demanded, given work, books, and occasional letters. Fellow prisoners sometimes teased him about his landing in the wrong country, but even they seemed to recognize that his story had grown beyond mockery. After the war, Faber returned to a ruined Germany. The Reich that had celebrated his skill was gone, his squadron scattered. The skis he once ruled were now filled with Allied aircraft patrolling zones of occupation. He found work quietly, first as a laborer, then as a technician, eventually returning to aviation in civilian maintenance. He rarely spoke about that day in Wales. But in a few interviews decades later, he admitted that the moment of his landing haunted him less as a mistake and more as a turning point in understanding. "I thought I was lost," he said, "but perhaps I delivered something to the world that it needed more than I did." Historians would later agree. The Focke-Wulf 190's accidental capture had done what espionage, bombing, and interception had failed to achieve. It had given the Allies a complete picture of their enemy's technological soul. With that knowledge came an intellectual victory that no bomb could deliver: comprehension. Understanding how the enemy thought, designed, and fought turned out to be the key to ending his dominance. In the years after the war, as nations rebuilt, the story of Faber's flight became something more than a wartime anecdote. It became a parable. Military academies taught it as a lesson in intelligence analysis. Engineers cited it as proof of the power of reverse engineering, and pilots repeated it as a cautionary tale about complacency. The very traits that had made Faber such a skilled pilot, confidence, precision, faith in his instruments, had also betrayed him when the world tilted a few degrees off course. By the 1950s, the butcher bird at Farnborough had been retired. Its final flight ended not with glory but with a quiet display behind museum ropes, a relic among relics. Children pressed their faces to the glass, staring at the smooth, deadly lines of its wings. Few understood how much of the modern world's aviation rested on that single plane. Yet to those who knew, it was more than metal. It was memory, a frozen moment when human error and human ingenuity met in midair. The air war that the FW-190 had once defined gave way to a new kind of conflict. Jets crossing continents, missiles replacing dogfights. Yet even in this new age, the old lesson lingered. Superior machines meant nothing without superior understanding. Every new design, from the swept wings of the 1950s to the stealth craft of later decades, owed something to that truth, the idea that knowledge, once captured, changes the very rules of the sky. And so the tale of Armin Faber endured. For the British pilots who studied the butcher bird, it was the story of how luck met preparation. For engineers, it was the story of how design reveals the mind of an enemy. And for soldiers everywhere, it was the story of how a single human mistake, born of fatigue, arrogance, or simple confusion, can alter the fate of nations. There is a photograph taken in 1943, rarely shown but haunting in its simplicity. It shows the captured FW-190 sitting on a runway at RAF Pembrey, surrounded by British ground crew. The men look both triumphant and astonished. The aircraft itself seems oddly serene, its propeller still, its fuselage gleaming in the coastal sun. In that image lies the essence of the event. A machine built for war rendered harmless by misunderstanding, turned instead into an instrument of learning. For all its drama, the capture of the Focke-Wulf 190 is not just a story about planes or battles. It is a story about the strange symmetry of war, the way destruction breeds discovery, and how even the most fearsome weapons can become teachers in the right hands. As years turned into decades, Faber lived out his days in quiet anonymity. He died in 2003 at the age of 85, having long since made peace with the past. The British never vilified him. The Germans never celebrated him. His legacy rested somewhere in between, in that gray sky over Wales where one man's compass failed and history found direction. Today, aviation historians still regard that single landing as one of the most extraordinary intelligence coups of World War II. A reminder that the course of war can turn not only on strategy or might, but on moments of sheer human fallibility. The butcher bird's wings, once feared, became blueprints for freedom. And in that, perhaps, there was redemption, not just for Armin Faber, but for every soldier who ever found himself lost in the vast, uncertain sky.